Good evening and welcome to the last in this sequence of webinars by the EVDA, so Cambridge District. So we've had a long sequence since lockdown started, and we're really pleased that we're able to welcome back Gareth Davis yet again. He very kindly started this sequence way back at the beginning of April. He's kindly done another one for us in the middle, and so we've travelled all the way from the 16th century, and tonight we're going to be talking about the 19th century. It's probably worthwhile going through a few of the housekeeping bits and bobs. So it's only the audio and video on mine and Gareth's computers which are active tonight, so you don't need to worry about making a noise or moving around. Just please enjoy the webinar in your own way. And exciting. It's ironic that just as I said that, we had somebody join with their video. That was very exciting. So yes, it's only nominally video on mine and Gareth's computers that are active. And then please do use the chat interface if you've got any technical questions or problems, or we'll see what we can do to help you out there. And please do submit questions as we go through tonight's material. We'll answer all the questions at the end, or Gareth will answer all the questions at the end, more precisely. So yeah, we look forward to the talk, and I am going to hand over to Gareth. Now the question is, I can see two people signed in as Gareth now, so let's go for this one. Hopefully this is Gareth. Hello, Gareth. Wonderful.
Sorry, I think the intruders are because I sent the wrong link to a group of people. So apologies. That's my fault.
It's wonderful. It's like being John Malkovich. If anyone's seen it, it's wonderful. But anyway, thank you very much, Gareth, for agreeing to do the talk tonight. And yeah, I'll hand over to you now.
Great, thanks. I'll start sharing my screen. So hopefully everybody can see that. So welcome back. Thank you for sticking with me and coming for yet another talk. When we left Cambridge at the end of the last talk, we'd reached the end of the 18th century, and I'd mainly focused on the activities of the Cambridge Youths. And those who saw that talk may remember that the last quarter of the century had been particularly successful with a large membership and numerous ringing triumphs. And I'm going to return to the Cambridge Youths and Great St Mary's eventually, but this time I want to spend a bit more time on the bells and the ringing at the other churches in Cambridge. However, first a brief consideration of the town itself as we enter the 19th century, and one thing in particular, the growth in population. So the population of Cambridge in 1801 was about 10,000. By 1831 it had doubled, by 1871 it had tripled, and by 1901 it was nearly 40,000. So at the beginning of the century, it was probably just about possible to know most of the people in the town personally or by reputation. 30 years later, it probably almost certainly wasn't. And the population growth was challenging and fragmenting many of the traditional networks and practices that had bound the town together. So as the 19th century started, 5 of the medieval parishes had bells that could only be chimed. And it's probably significant that they were the furthest away from the centre of the town, originally with the smaller populations and probably less money. And the other 9 parishes all had bells hung for full circle ringing, from the 3 at All Saints to the 12 at Great St Mary's. And the parish records show that at around 1800, the bells were being rung regularly, if not necessarily frequently, at all 9 churches. By 1900, though, it had ceased everywhere except Great St Mary's and Great St Andrews. The reasons why ringing stopped varied from church to church, but they were all directly or indirectly the result of wider social, economic and religious changes, either in the town itself or in the country. But for completeness tonight, I'm going to start by looking briefly at the 19th century experience of the churches that only had chiming bells. And we have a useful source of evidence for the state of each church and its bells at the beginning of the century. John Botel, who was bookbinder, antiquarian and member of the Cambridge Youths until his death in 1813, was compiling a history of Cambridge, which fortunately contains an entry for each church, including some information about the bells. In the end, it was never published, but the manuscript's in Downing College Library. And the other main sources I've used for this research are the parish records, the Cambridge Youths records, the local newspapers, and after 1871, the various ringing publications that started to appear. So let's start with left-hand corner, St. Peter's near the Folk Museum. Apart from the view, it's changed little from what Botel said about it in 1800. The steeple affords nothing remarkable. It is a small tower of stone surmounted by a neat spire, which from the eminence whereon it is seated affords an agreeable prospect in the fields to the west, and contains only one bell, on which is Ricardus Bowler, May Fake It, 1603. St. Giles, on the other hand, which stands on the opposite side of the Huntingdon Road, has a slightly more interesting history. At the time that John Cole made his drawing in 1740, the bells were contained in a timber shed in the churchyard. Originally, there were 5, and the inscriptions on all 5 were recorded in the early 1700s. By the time the shed was demolished in 1796, there were only 2 left. They then appear to have been moved into the new turret when the church was remodeled to increase the seating from 100 to 600 in 1814. And eventually, when that church proved not to be big enough either for the new population, an entirely new church was built in 1875 at a cost of £8,000, but without a tower. A plan was drawn up for the tower, but it was never built. Until 2009, the 2 bells that survived stood on the floor of the church, and then they were sent to tailors for an overhaul, and by coincidence, they were in the foundry at the same time that the new bells for Great St. Mary's were being cast. When they came back, they were hung on the west wall where they remain today. In terms of ringing there are only a very few records of the bells being chimed in the 19th century, mainly for the death of members of the royal family. If we go over the bridge now up to St. Clement's, Barry talked about this fairly recently in one of his talks. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but originally the church had no tower, but William Cole, the antiquary, left money for a tower to be built, and he wanted it built in the yard on the northeast side of the church, where a wooden shed enclosing one bell stood, or what Coles described as the disgraceful wooden steeple in an old tree. He didn't get his way because the tower wasn't built where he wanted it to, but it was eventually built in 1821, and there were 2 bells hung there, and they survived to this day. But the surviving parish records are almost entirely silent on any uses the bells were put to, other than calling people to church. Skipping to a slightly different part of town now, St. Andrew the Less, near the Elizabeth Way roundabout, is perhaps the most extreme example of a medieval church not being able to cope with the population changes. The 13th century church was originally part of the Priory of Barnwell, and had 2 small bells which hang in the openings you can see in the west wall. The condition of the building was, and still is apparently, very poor, and it was far too small to accommodate all the parishioners. So in 1839, the then new Christ Church was built on Newmarket Road. It was opened by the Bishop of Ely, and the description of the event gives an indication of how far the bells could be heard around the town at the time. It describes the procession to the new church. It moved up St. Andrew's Street, where the windows of the houses were graced not only by the inhabitants, but by many fair faces from far places, which I have to say is a rather nice phrase. The streets were lined the whole way with a vast assemblage of people. It arrived at Newmarket Road, and the sight of the vast number of ladies at the houses and on the Maid's Causeway in all the gay attire of the season was truly delightful. The bells, too, of St. Mary's, ringing the whole way, and the wind bringing the sound very distinctly added greatly to the scene. So for ringing so nicely, the Cambridge youths were paid £1 by the bishop. The church, Christ Church, apparently has one bell, but I don't have any details of it, and I'm not entirely sure I know where it's hung. But let's move on to St Mary the Less, or Little St Mary's in Trumpington Street. It's quite difficult to pin down the history of the bells here. There were 3 in 1552, but sometime after Cole did a drawing of the church in the mid-18th century, complete at the time with its 12th century tower, the tower was demolished. Botel says that a small tower was rebuilt in 1789, but 2 of the bells also seem to have disappeared. However, the single bell was put to good use, and the church warden's records show that the bell was rung or chimed regularly during the early part of the 19th century. In 1810, the payments included 5 shillings for ringing on Easter Monday, when the new church wardens were elected, and 2 shillings each on May the 29th for O'Capple Day, June the 4th for George III's birthday, September the 22nd for the anniversary of the coronation, October the 25th for the anniversary of the King's accession to the throne, and on November the 5th for Bonfire Night. And those were regular annual payments until 1812, but after that there only seemed to be payments to the parish clerk for chiming for services. And after 1835, even those payments stopped. And there are just occasional payments, again for tolling for royal funerals. And then at some point the tower was completely demolished and the bell moved to its current rooftop position, possibly when the church was restored in the 1850s. I've also included 3 of the new 19th century churches on this slide as a reminder that many of the parishes were being subdivided to deal with the expanding population. It's an irony, perhaps, that it's St Matthew's, the church without a proper tower, that has 3 bells installed, while St Paul's and St Luke's have towers capable of holding complete rings, but have only 1 bell between them. The inclusion of 3 bells at St Matthew's may have been because the church was designed by the local architect Richard Reynolds Rowe, who was also responsible for the Corn Exchange. And either he or his father, I can't quite work it out at the moment, were elected to the Cambridge Youths as honorary ringing member in 1854. And Rowe will pop up again later when we talk about St Benet's. Anyway, so that's it for the chiming bells. So now let's have a look at the change ringing bells at the beginning of the 19th century. And let's start with All Saints, originally opposite Trinity College, where the site's now a small garden and used as a craft market. Unfortunately, there are no church accounts for the whole of the 18th century and up to the 1870s. So it's difficult to know how much ringing there was at All Saints after 1700. There's evidence that they were rung on occasions. They certainly rang for the parliamentary elections in 1839 and 1852, for example. As you can see in the photograph, in 1821, a passage was made through the steeple of the church and the churchyard wall was set back. And then in 1852, £8 was spent on putting the bells back into repair. But by that time, plans were already being discussed for a new church. The old church was demolished in 1865 after the completion of the new All Saints in Jesus Lane. The bells there were hung for chiming. There's a curious entry in the vestry records for 1877, though, where Pleasance the sexton offered to subscribe 1 guinea to the £15 cost of hanging the bells for the purpose of chiming. It's not entirely clear whether that means that originally they weren't hung for chiming and that they were only done later, or whether he had something else in mind. But we never find out because a few months later he was replaced as the sexton. At Holy Sepulchre, the round church, we have another church whose peal of bells was lost as a result of rebuilding work. In this case, not a new church, but the restoration undertaken by the Cambridge Camden Society in 1841. The Camden Society was set up to restore churches to what the Society believed they'd been like at the time of the Reformation. It was almost an attempt to re-Catholicize them. And they carried out several early projects in Cambridge, including removing stone balls that were on the top of Great St Mary's Tower and stripping the render off St Benet's so that the Saxon tower construction could be fully seen. However, their most ambitious project in Cambridge was at St Sepulchre's. The 15th century belfry, which you can see on the left, was demolished and 3 of the 4 bells were sold. The remaining one, together with a Sanctus bell of about 1450, were hung dead in a newly built bell turret. There's not much evidence that these bells were rung regularly before the restoration work. The only annual occasion seems to have been for the Easter election of the churchwardens, but they were certainly rung for the borough election in 1839. Churchwardens made a point of it. They'd voted Tory, and when their winning candidate processed around the town, they had the bells rung, possibly to rub the noses of the losing Liberals, who were headquartered at the Hoop Hotel, which was just along the road on the corner of Jesus Lane. The 3 bells that were dispensed with must have sat around for a while because they weren't finally shipped to a foundry in King's Lynn until 1847. Moving nearer to the marketplace, we come to St Michael's. Raven says that the tenor bell had hung useless until it was set in order in 1806 by Thomas Safford, who later joined the Cambridge Youths. And the church had a spire originally, but that was removed in 1818. There were so many payments for repairs to the bells and fittings in the 1830s, 40s and 50s that the bells must surely have been rung. But in the absence of churchwarden accounts and only occasional other references, it's guesswork about how frequently. The church was damaged by fire in 1849, and after 1860, the only payments seem to have been for service chiming, and by 1883, the tower was regarded as unsafe. A payment in 1896 refers to some work on the bells and includes fixing cords to clappers, so they may just have been clocked by then. St Michael's is a reminder that although the overall population of the town was expanding, there came a point where most of the new building was towards the suburbs of Cherry Hinton, Chesterton and Barnwell, and by the 1880s, some of the central town parishes were shrinking and money was hard to come by. Not only had compulsory church rates been abolished, but when the university and colleges ceased to be solely Church of England institutions in 1870, there was concern that they wouldn't even pay the voluntary church rate. And the living at St Michael's was only worth £6 a year, nowhere near enough to attract a clergyman to become vicar. As a result, there were several proposals to amalgamate the parish with Great St Mary's at the turn of the century, one of which eventually bore fruit. As for the bells, they were removed in the 1950s with the intention that they should go to the new church in Cashmere Hills, Christchurch, New Zealand. However, 3 were later stolen from the Founder's Yard, and it took until 1982 before the remaining one was finally installed in its New Zealand home. On the other side of the marketplace from Great St Mary's, we've got Holy Trinity. This is how it used to look before it was remodelled. The new 5 had been cast in 1705, and the church almost certainly had its own band in the 18th century, and they were rung frequently in the first 2 decades of the 19th century as well, for the usual range of parish and royal events, though Holy Trinity was particularly diligent in using their bells to celebrate military victories. 2 of the last ringing payments there were in 1854 and 1855, first for a false report that Sebastopol had been taken during the Crimean War, and then, just a year later, that it actually had been. Ringing here declined significantly after the 1820s. The last record of the ringers being paid was in 1857 for the Princess Royal's wedding, and there are no records of them being rung after that. The bells seem to have become derelict and were until they were sold in the 1950s, possibly at the time that the church was trying to fund a new organ, though the records are a bit unclear and this probably needs a bit more investigation. Also on Trumpington Street, we've got St Botolph's. 4 bells, for the treble dated 1470 and the 3 back bells 1486. And they were rung regularly until at least 1748, when the surviving churchwarden's accounts disappear. Major work was carried out on them in 1820, and they certainly rang after that. In December 1829, the bells were rung to celebrate the corporation of the town losing a protracted court case arising from their attempt to impose tolls on merchants carrying goods into the town over the Great Bridge. That's the one in Bridge Street. They rang at parliamentary elections in 1839 and 1852, and in 1843, when Queen Victoria visited. There was a lot of work done to the church in the second half of the century, and it's not clear whether that interfered with the ringing. It's likely, though, that they weren't ringing by the turn of the century, and the Ellacombe chiming system seems to have been installed in 1907. St Edward's. 4 bells in 1552, but they became 6 in 1669. The tower was very active during the 18th century, and the bells continued to be rung regularly until at least 1837, for Easter Tuesday and all the other usual events that every church celebrated. And the standard payment at most of those occasions, as it was at most of the other churches, was 2 shillings and 6pence, or half a crown. A crown being 5 shillings, and for those born after 1970s, 5 shillings is now 25p. At all the churches, the money was paid not in cash, but in beer, enough for each member of a 6-bell band to have 2 or 3 pints each. The payments tended to rotate around the bigger and more respectable inns in each parish. And the most common one at St Edward's was the 3 tons. In the photo on the right, at the bottom photo, just past the end of the church, there's a white building, and that's where the 3 tons inn stood. And until 1796, John Hazard, who was one of the Cambridge youths, was the landlord there before he moved around the corner and into St Benet's parish to take over the Eagle and Child. But 2 of the other leading members of the Cambridge youths also lived in the parish, and one of them, James Coe, didn't die until 1837. And it's perhaps just a coincidence that his death and the apparent cessation of regular ringing happened in the same year. The following year, there were significant repairs done, but after 1850, the only recorded expenditure is on buying bell ropes. And after 1880, there appears to have been no ringing at all until the bells were restored in 1994. So let's follow Hazard and pop round the corner to St Benet's, where a continuous run of churchwardens' accounts gives us a much more complete picture of ringing activity. At the beginning of the century, the bells were being rung at all the usual annual events at the usual price of half a crown. Though in 1820, those payments rose to 5 shillings, which reflected the increased price of beer. In 1825, a new 4th bell was cast, and Thomas Safford of the Cambridge youths gave an estimate for £14, but in the end, the church went with Dobson of Downham Market, who quoted slightly more. Ringing for the coronation and for the accessions stopped in about 1848, and 10 years later, so did the ringing for the restoration of the monarchy, Bonfire Night, and the Queen's birthday. Ringing for the Easter election of the churchwardens lasted a rather longer, another 5 years, but then it too stopped in 1863. After that, the bells were still rung occasionally, but only for special events. 2 guineas was paid to the ringers for the vicar's marriage in 1884, and 3 guineas for preservation of the parish the same year. I don't know whether the proposal was to split the parish or to amalgamate it with another one. In 1887, there was a dumb peal rung for Swan, long-serving churchwarden, but that was the last recorded payment for ringing. It's clear, though, that the bells were not in a great state of repair by the 1850s. In 1855, a newspaper report noted that the bells were out of order and could not be rung. And in 1885, the Bell News reported on a meeting at St Benet's at which the churchwarden put in an appearance and expressed his pleasure at meeting ringers once again, claiming that the bells had not been rung since August 1864. Although, in fact, actually, the Cambridge youths had rung a 720 of Kent on them in 1875. However, that was probably an exception, because in 1865, severe reservations had been expressed about the effect that the bells were having on the structure of the tower. And this is where Richard Reynolds Rowe re-enters the picture. The concern seems to have been triggered by some work done in the church that year to remove the western gallery, replace the ringer's floor and the staircase in the tower. And while those were removed, some kind of temporary access was to be provided for the ringers to the new floor. However, when Rowe inspected the tower, he concluded that the bells at St Benet's were too large, that their vibration was damaging its structure, and as he said, whence it is evident not only that the tower contains its own elements of destruction, but that their forces are ever active, that's the bells, and that unless arrested at once, they will eventually and certainly reduce the tower into a heap of ruin. His solution was to disconnect the frame from the tower walls and support it on a separate wooden framework that rested on the ground and went up through the various tower stages. Of course, as we know from going to St. Benet's, his plan wasn't put into effect and the tower's still standing. However, between 1865 and 1881, it's not at all clear, if there was ringing, how the ringers got to the ringing room. There was a difference of opinion in the parish about whether a spiral staircase should be erected, and it took them until 1881 to decide that they wouldn't do that, but install a perpendicular ladder. There was occasional ringing at Bennett's in the 1880s, but nearly every record comments on how difficult they were to ring. There are no records at all from the 1890s that I've been able to find, and it's not until 1912 that they're inspected by members of the University Guild and the Ely Diocese Association, who find them almost unringable, but manage a 720 of plain bob minor and 120 of Stedman doubles. And having mentioned Stedman, this is probably a convenient moment to mention Fabian Stedman. The claim that Stedman was born in Cambridge in 1631 first appeared in the 19th century. It appeared in Shipway's Campanologia, published in 1816, and it was then repeated ad infinitum elsewhere, without question, until it became accepted as fact. In 1865, a gloss was added to the story when C.H. Cooper, who was the clerk to the council, published his Memorials of Cambridge and claimed that Stedman had been the parish clerk at St. Benet's. There's no credible evidence for any of this. In fact, as John Eisel and others have shown, Stedman was actually baptized in 1640 at Yarkhill in Herefordshire, and nobody has yet found any association between him and Cambridge. Nevertheless, by the 1930s, Stedman and Cambridge were so inextricably linked that it was agreed by the Central Council that funds should be raised to restore St. Benet's bells to mark Stedman's supposed tercentenary in 1931. We can be grateful that that work was carried out, even if the money was raised under false pretenses. As part of the work, the bells were lowered in the tower and the ringing room moved down to the floor of the church, where we ring them now. So overall, the 19th century was not really a good one for most of the churches where there'd been full circle ringing at the beginning of the century. Most of the bells had either been lost, converted to chimes, or fallen silent. And by the end, only at Great St. Andrews and Great St. Mary's was there any change ringing being practiced. So let's have a look at those churches. On the left, we've got the old church of St. Andrews, which stood until the new one was built in 1843. The church had 3 bells until 1722, when 2 more were purchased, the same year that Great St. Mary's were augmented to 10. And they remained at 5 until 1808, when Botel recorded that another was added to make 6 and hung in a new tower which had been rebuilt 5 years earlier. However, the old church was entirely demolished in 1842, and the new one, on the right, built to accommodate a congregation of 850. It still proved not to be big enough, as it turned out, as by 1862, parishioners were having to attend church elsewhere, and a third evening service was introduced, for which the bell ringer's salary for chiming before services was increased by £2 to £8 a year. When the new church was built, the front 4 of the 6 were recast by Mears. The back 2 were retained, a 1667 bell and one of the 1722 bells. And Raven records how somebody described to him that they were mucky, yawling things without a bit of music in them, with which apparently he agreed. Nevertheless, they seem to have been retained again when the bells were further augmented to 8 in 1856, with the 2 new trebles paid for by the vicar, Joseph Cooper. And of course, as I'm sure most of you know, the bells were eventually recast again in 1956 at the expense of the University Guild. The parish accounts are missing for the period between 1770 and 1840, so it's difficult to know how much ringing there was in that period. But when they resume in 1840, the parish only makes occasional payments for ringing, and none after 1864, when the Prince of Wales visits the town. However, they were rung regularly by the Cambridge Youths, who instituted a Friday practice there. I was interested to discover when I was doing this research that 1859 proved to be a bit of watershed in the arrangements for bells ringing in Cambridge in a number of ways. Since the 17th century, single bells at Great St Mary's had been sounded every day at 5 in the morning and 9 at night to wake the town and mark the end of the day. It was one of the jobs which the Great St Mary's steeplekeeper was paid to do. In about 1680, it was agreed that rather than St Mary's bearing the whole cost, each parish would contribute 5 shillings a year, money which the steeplekeeper would collect directly from them. By the 19th century, the 5 o'clock bell had been moved back an hour to 6, but the amount paid by each parish remained the same, though those furthest from Great St Mary's had stopped paying. In 1859, Susan Briggs, the steeplekeeper, petitioned the Borough Council to take over the payments from the parishes, which they agreed to do. And they agreed to pay her £1 a quarter, which was good for her, but it did sever one of the direct connections between all the parishes and the bells. You'll have noticed that at all the churches we've looked at, there's been a gradual, or in some cases sudden, disappearance of the ringing for which the parish authorities traditionally paid. And 1859 was a key date in that respect too. One of the reasons why the bells traditionally rang on the 29th of May for the restoration of the monarchy and on the 5th of November for gunpowder treason was that churches were required by Act of Parliament to mark those days with special prayers set out in the prayer book. However, by the mid-19th century, there were concerns about the continued appropriateness of officially celebrating Bonfire Night, for instance, with its overtones of anti-Catholic sentiment. In 1859, therefore, the requirements for both days to be celebrated was removed by the Anniversary Days Observance Act. Churches no longer had to hold special services on those days. They thus had no reason to pay the ringers, and in the absence of payment, the ringers stopped ringing. However, that legal change seems to have also triggered a more general rethink of the organisation of ringing for national events in Cambridge. From 1859 onwards, it's only Great St Mary's where the bells mark the annual celebrations of the monarch's birthday, coronation and accession, and the Prince of Wales' birthday. And payments for those were now made by the Borough Council and the University, not by the parishes, who'd been entirely relieved of the financial responsibility. It's probably true that many of the parishes were already uncomfortable with the tradition of paying in beer. This was the age of the temperance movement, but they no longer had to worry about it. For the ringers at Great St Mary's, on the other hand, instead of receiving 5 shillings in beer for each event, which they had to share between them, they were now being paid 2 guineas in cash by both the university and the borough for most of the events. And I do wonder whether both organisations knew that the other one was paying. But it was a useful addition to their earnings, especially as other sources of income were declining. So now, finally, let's turn to the Cambridge Youths and Great St Mary's. As we saw last time, the 18th century had been very successful in terms of their ringing achievements, the size of their membership, and the amounts they earned. And the first years of the 19th century didn't look as if they were going to be any different. War with France had provided lots of additional opportunities to ring for profit, to celebrate military victories by Nelson and Wellington. And the society continued to open new rings. So it opened Bourne in 1807 and Ramsey in 1811, for instance. However, all was not as rosy as it might have seemed. Firstly, the nature of the membership was changing. As I hope you can see from this graph, the social and economic status of the ringers changed significantly between the 18th and 19th centuries. The lawyers, academics, civil servants, town councillors and gentlemen of leisure were no longer joining, and the society was becoming increasingly dependent on small tradesmen, servants and labourers. And with the change in membership came a loss of influence. The interests of ringers and ringing were no longer as well represented by the higher echelons of people who ran the town. There were also fewer members during the 19th century, at times hardly enough to make up a band. When the new church at Great St Andrews was opened in 1843, Cambridge Jews were only able to muster a band to ring all 6 because they were joined by a visitor. It's difficult to know whether this smaller society was of necessity or choice. The history of the ringing at the other churches would suggest that despite the population growth, there were fewer ringers in the town and thus fewer of the standard required by the society to become members. On the other hand, the opening decades of the century were economically difficult. Food prices rose sharply during the Napoleonic Wars, and the years after the peace were equally hard. Given that paid ringing provided a useful source of income and was more significant to those nearer the bottom of the economic ladder, it may have been that keeping the membership small was a financial decision. Almost amazingly, even in 1929, the existing members of the society were arguing against letting in too many new members because of the impact it would have on their sharing of the income. And paid ringing continued to rise during the first half of the 19th century. In the second half, the number of occasions declined, pink line, but the overall income was maintained largely because they increased the charges that they made for ringing. Though if I'd shown you the graph with inflation, it's not quite so rosy. Another change in the nature of the membership was the almost complete loss of ringers who had any direct association with the university. In the 18th century, the Cambridge Jews had united town and gown. Now it was very firmly a town society. However, society was not averse to welcoming students. Leonard Proctor attended Trinity College between 1834 and 1838 and was largely taught to ring at Great St Mary's, though the band there charged him £1 a month for the privilege. And he later returned to his home at Bennington in Hertfordshire and developed a band of his servants and tenants that rang numerous peals up to his death in 1907, including Superlative, London, Cambridge, Double Norwich and Stedman Triples. He became the first honorary ringing member of the society, and the Cambridge Jews visited him regularly on annual outings and other occasions. So if the membership numbers had declined, what was the society ringing in the 19th century? We get our first glimpse from Samuel Lee. Lee had rung in peals with the Union Society of Shrewsbury from 1803 to his last peal in 1811. He entered Queen's College in 1813 and became Professor of Arabic there in 1819, later being made Regius Professor of Hebrew. However, in 1817, he described a visit to Great St Mary's and a letter to his ringing friend Samuel Lawrence. 29th of November, 1817. Your conversation and papers revived in a small degree my former love for the exercise, insomuch that I was tempted to ascend the bell loft of Cambridge and to ring a bell in a short touch of Bob Royal. I had not quite forgotten it, but whether these bells went extremely ill or whether my want of practice was the cause, I know not. But my arms felt so excessively strained that I could scarcely do anything for a short time after. It is curious that those bells are hung in such a manner that the position of the ropes in the belfry is contrary to any I have ever seen, which appeared very awkward to me. The bells are finely toned, 10 in number. The ringing generally was not good. Lee invited Lawrence to visit Cambridge, but warned the ringers are very far inferior to your Birmingham friends. They ring Bob Royal, treble 10 and caters, but rather in an inferior style. But I dare say they'll be glad to meet you. The Cambridge Jews may have been ringing Royal in 1817, but they certainly weren't by 1843. As you can see from the list of those who were members in 1817, most were dead or had left by 1843. Only 2 remained, and John Chapman also died in 1844. Most of them were not replaced. The years between 1817 and 1843 seem to have been a low point for change ringing, though the members were doing very well from their paid ringing. 1843 is significant because it was the year that John Carr arrived in Cambridge, the visitor who'd made up the band at the opening of Great St Andrews. And under his influence, the ambition and enthusiasms of the ringers revived somewhat. Some of you may have read my article in the Ringing World about John Carr, and if you did, you'll know that it would be possible to have a whole talk just on him. However, for those who didn't, the short version is as follows. Carr learnt to ring at Waltham Abbey, and he and his brother taught themselves to chime 8-bell methods on 4 bells each, and they also learned to ring touches and major on 4 handbells each. In the 1820s, John spent 3 years teaching a band at Hertford before finding occupation as a landlord of the 3 Tuns Inn in Waltham Abbey. However, he suffered mental health problems, and in 1840, his wife Charlotte had him committed to a private asylum at High Beach near Epping. He was released a little under a year later, although unfortunately at the same time as he was coming out, Charlotte was being committed to the same institution. Carr returned to the 3 Tuns, but he clearly couldn't cope. And in 1843, he decided to set off on what turned into a 5-year walking and ringing tour of East Anglia, which he recorded details of in his narrative of various peals in change ringing, which you can find the full text of on the Central Council website. After making a few visits to Cambridge, Carr decided to make it his base, and he joined the Cambridge Youths. And under his leadership over the next 4 years, the band revived and rang several long lengths, though no full peals. But by April 1844, he was able to report that on practice night, we rang 6 courses with the 5-6-7 at home, which was the best striking on Granser triples I have heard at Cambridge, and the company were very much encouraged and pleased at their improvement. Under his tutelage, the band also specialised in ringing date touches composed by Carr, though one of them he found so difficult to compose that the society had to reimburse him the cost of the paper and ink he'd used so much. Carr returned to Waltham Abbey in 1848, and there the Cambridge part of his story ends. Sadly, his illness eventually recurred, and he spent the last 5 years of his life in the Essex County Lunatic Asylum at Whalley near Brentwood, which is the building at the bottom. Even more sadly, both his wife and daughter ended their lives in the same institution. However, he'd left Cambridge ringing in a much better state than he'd found it. As we can see from the entries in the Felsted database, there were no peals rung in Cambridge between 1797 and 1850. The 1830 record, which is the top one on this list, is almost certainly a mistake on the part of Morris in his history of change ringing, and probably an accidental duplication of the 1850 peal. However, I think there are a couple of things in this peal list that are worthy of attention, and they indicate some fundamental changes in how ringing was being organised and also in how it was being perceived. Firstly, there's a clear change from peals being rung and attributed to a single band, such as the Cambridge Youth peals in 1850 and 1852, towards mixed or association level bands. Clearly that was being enabled by better transport and communications, but it was also making it easier for individual ringers to develop their own skills. The Cambridge Youths didn't have a band capable of ringing a peal of Stedman and Caters in 1890, but the 4 who could were able to form part of the Essex Association band. The ringers' first loyalty may still have been to their own tower, but increasingly they were developing wider personal relationships, and individual Cambridge ringers pop up in peals in all kinds of places in the second half of the century. The second point arises from the 1897 peal of Plain Bob Major, which, as the peal board records, was rung on the Siege apparatus. That's S-E-A-G-E. I don't know whether people know what Siege apparatus is, but essentially, for those of you not aware, it was effectively the first ringing simulator. Small bells were placed in the ringing room, which by a system of wires and levers sounded instead of the church bells, which were silenced. 2 years after its formation in 1879, the Cambridge University Guild had asked to be allowed to install the apparatus at Great St Andrews. They were refused, though they were allowed to continue practicing at the church on the open bells. They then approached the ringers and clergy at Great St Mary's for permission to ring there from time to time and to install Siege's apparatus there. And permission was granted. The approach was made by the Reverend Bowie, the president of the CUG and later vicar of Great St Mary's. In his letter, he said, "We've mentioned to the town ringers our intention of applying to you for this purpose, and they see no objection to it. Indeed, since the apparatus would be there for them to practice new methods and new hands upon it, it would probably save them and the neighbours the annoyance of hearing the unsuccessful attempts, which are the disagreeable part of open ringing. Our society is, I think, a useful one. The members are nice, quiet undergraduates, most of whom will find a knowledge of bell ringing of considerable use in the country parishes to which they may hereafter go." So the sieges apparatus was installed on the front 8, and as the peal shows, the town ringers did indeed make use of it. But that they needed to do so is a clear sign that attitudes to the sounds of bells had changed over the last 50 years. In 1830, the bells at Great St Mary's had rung over 30 times during the general election contest without a murmur of protest. Now, any ringing, especially during term time, was likely to generate hostile comments. And the CUG clearly didn't always use the simulator. In 1893, the editor of the student magazine Granta started a diatribe. "I have received some very violent complaints on the subject of Cambridge University Guild of Change Ringers," before continuing, "Not that anybody objects to the existence of that excellent body, and the ringing of bells may be an exercise extremely healthy for mind and body. There's absolutely nothing immoral about it, but the objections begin when they proceed to use the Tower of Great St Mary's as their pleasure ground and the bells of that church as their musical instruments. On this matter, the university are not logical. Up to 1 o'clock in the day, piano playing is in most colleges supposed to be forbidden. Yet these bell ringers begin in the most unblushing manner to pour forth their volumes of sound at 12 on Saturdays. And again from 8:30 to 9:30, they're in full swing on Tuesday evenings, which I think is when they rang at Great St Andrews. The annoyance caused by such proceedings is really very great. How would the authorities like a rifle range in the marketplace? The noise could not be more unpleasant than that made by these continuous peals. In fact, rifle fire would not have been that unusual. An anecdote told by the Archdeacon of Huntingdon in 1902 demonstrates not only that bells and gunfire often went together, but that the ringers had a very well-developed sense of how to divert criticism. He recalled his first acquaintance with ringers, which occurred when he was a clergyman at Great St Mary's, Cambridge, a long time ago. It was just after the Crimean War. The ringers were anxious to take their part in the general rejoicings and proposed, besides ringing and firing their bells, to let off guns from the top of the tower. It was represented to him that this must not be allowed, and he was deputed to interview the ringers in their tower. The interview ended in an unexpected manner, for the ringers forthwith elected him a member of their company, and he thought it possible that his name was still on their books, for he remembered that they termed him a life member. And indeed, his name was still on the books. The Reverend Vesey had been made an honorary member in January 1858. Vesey told that anecdote at an Ely Diocesan Association meeting, which is a reminder of the other big change that occurred at the end of the 19th century, the emergence of county and diocesan associations. Again, this is not the occasion to tell the whole story of the association, but it did have a checkered beginning. The first attempts were not terribly successful. The idea was first proposed in 1881, and a committee set up to carry the idea forward. The association was eventually launched in 1883, but ran into immediate difficulties with the ringers in the Bedford Archdeaconry, who had already formed the Bedfordshire Association a few weeks earlier. The Ely continued without them, but by 1888, even visitors were commenting publicly on the apathy shown towards the association, and the Bell News picked up on the state of affairs. And an editorial said, "It certainly can't be maintained that the majority of ringers in the Ely diocese possess any remarkable aptitude for great exertion, so far as the exercise of ringing is concerned. Neither do we find among them any sign of a movement which is calculated to give encouragement to the honorary secretary. Are the ringers of the countries concerned affected by any peculiarity of the soil therein? This part of East Anglia is believed to be of a flat, marshy, and somewhat stagnant nature. If this is true, has it a corresponding effect on the people who inhabit it? The suggestion would seem reasonable so as far as ringers are concerned. Among the ringing associations, the one we are dealing with seems to be the most backward in every respect." In the face of that, the Secretary Kenelm Smith had more success when he formed an Archdiaconal Society just for the Isle of Ely in 1890 within the wider association. And remarkably, that succeeded in attracting much more interest, to the point where by 1897 it was big enough to merge with the moribund full Ely Association and form the new Ely Diocesan Association. Anyway, let's end as we began with a look at how the ringing landscape changed during the century. It had clearly shrunk, with most churches either losing their change ringing bells or abandoning any attempt to maintain them or have them rung. The first 40 years of the century had also seen a decline in the standards and ambitions of the ringers. Some recovery took place in the second half of the century, but ringing didn't reach the same heights it had done 100 years earlier. Meanwhile, in the town, the sound of bells was losing its meaning. When bells were ringing frequently, knowing why they were ringing must have depended largely on word of mouth. Why are the bells ringing, says Mrs. A. Mrs. B down the road told me that it was for Mr. C's marriage, says Mr. D. But as the population grew, that word of mouth, collective knowledge, dependent on close social networks, became more difficult to transmit. Why are the bells ringing, said Mr. A. No idea, says Mr. B. I wish they'd shut up. I'll finish with one last irony. Whilst the Church of England was struggling and failing to maintain and use its bells, the most magnificent ring of bells in the town, well, at least until Great St. Mary's were recast, were being installed in a Roman Catholic church. The 8 bells hung for ringing, were cast in 1895 before work on the new church of Our Lady and English Martyrs was completed in 1890. Unlike the Church of England bells, they seem to have been rung for services. A band from the parish club was taught by the ringers from Great St. Mary's. Though it's not clear whether it was full circle ringing or chiming that caused the nearby parish church of St. Paul to complain. At the vestry meeting of St. Paul's Church, Cambridge in 1898, the chairman said that every Sunday morning their quiet communion service was greatly disturbed by the Roman Catholic church bells. When they first started, they hoped they would get used to them. But as they continued to disturb them, he took the opportunity of speaking to the Roman Catholic priest and said he would consult his congregation. But for a long time, he could get no response. Eventually, he replied that the St. Paul's bells rang for 5 minutes before 8 o'clock, and that disturbed the Roman Catholic service. The speaker had given orders that the St. Paul's bell should be rung for only half a minute to warn the people and half a minute when the service was to commence, and expressed a hope that the Roman Catholic priest would see his way to having his rung for a short time only. This he refused to do, and so every Sunday morning, half the St. Paul's quiet service was disturbed by the ringing of the Roman Catholic bells. Fortunately, we appreciate their sound more than the Victorian parishioners of St. Paul's, and I'm pleased to see that as of a couple of hours ago, Olem were leading the way in voting for the first round group in the Facebook poll for best ring between 30 and 40 hundredweight. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to try and answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Gareth. That was fantastic again. Yeah, so please do submit any questions through the Q&A interface. I noticed that Christopher Gray was mentioned in terms of St Edward King and Martyr, but what can you tell us about Christopher Gray? He is the son of Miles Gray of Colchester, is that right?
I'm afraid I'm not an expert on bell founders, so I'm not going to be able to tell you anything much about him, I'm afraid.
Well, because the only thing I know about him is that he wasn't, it's one of those things that he seems to be defined entirely in the negative, in the sense that people say, oh yes, well, he's not Miles Gray of Colchester. So yes, he wasn't Miles and he didn't live in Colchester.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't tell you much about the bell founders. It's not my main area of interest, I'm afraid. So, but I'm sure there are people on here who could.
Yeah, so if anyone could tell me anything about the family of bell founders, formerly of Colchester, that'd be wonderful. I think people are still taking their time thinking whether there's anything to ask.
No, that's fine.
But yeah, I think it's also worthwhile saying that, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the last one of this series, and we're hoping to restart again on Thursday, the 24th of September, and we'll be going over to a format where we run them once a fortnight from there on. Yes, obviously lockdown situations permitting. Well, believe it or not, you might have
no questions.
Yeah,
excellent.
No questions. So that's there you go. Oh, one of your alter egos has now submitted a question. You mentioned Susan Briggs as steeplekeeper in the 1850s, I think. Was it unusual to have a female in this role? Was she able to ring? And I think this sort of intersects with one of the questions from 16th century, 17th century. So yeah, well, how about that?
Yeah, so she took over the role from her husband, Richard Briggs, who died in 1818 or 1820, I think. I think it's highly unlikely that she rang the bells herself, because there are references to having to employ assistants to do the practical ringing. And in fact, the parish complained at one point that too many people were going up the tower and making too much trouble while they were doing this. But she did do the role until she was 90.
Oh, excellent. Sue Marsden says, I noticed you mentioned the name Thomas Safford.
Yeah.
Was this the same one that cast the bell at Fendraiton, whose foundry was at Birdbolt Lane?
That's correct. He was. As far as I know, he only cast 2 bells, the Fendraiton one and one of the bells for one of the colleges. He was clearly kind of keen on doing it, though, from judging by his bid to recast the 4th at St. Benet's. But they must have thought he didn't have the experience, I suspect. He was a tinsmith, and bell founding and bell hanging seems to have been a bit of a sideline for him. He was also the High Constable of his parish for a while, and was involved in hauling people off to court after various riots.
Well, there you go. And so it's a natural synergy with bell ringing and bell founding, isn't it? It's
yeah. One of the interesting things is that almost all of the work that was done on the bells in Cambridge, whichever church it was during the 19th century, was done by one or other of the Cambridge youths. They did most of the maintenance work at a price in the town.
I have a question from Stephen Theobald, which says, what is a whitesmith? Well, there you go.
So a whitesmith is a tinsmith. Essentially, they are the same things. That goes with the question about what's a peruke maker, I think, from last time.
Okay, well, so here we go. Another, maybe the same alter ego, but one of the alter egos is asking, why did ringing change from being a pursuit of the gentry to a more working class one during the 19th century?
I think the change probably happened at the end of the 18th century. So my theory about it, as far as it relates to Cambridge, which I think I talked about a bit in the last talk, is that the ringing for payment had become so important, and it's such a demand on the people who are doing it, that it became almost inappropriate for people of greater rank to be taking part in it. So, being paid by one of your peers to ring for your wedding was probably not regarded as the thing a gentleman would do in the late 18th century. But I think there's more work to be done on this. It's probably more complex than that.
Wonderful. George Unsworth comments that she believes the first female member of the Youths was Miss G. Johnson in 1959. So yeah, that's perhaps gives some context to the idea of accomplished ringers who were women.
Though I think there might have been an earlier one, but I can't find the record at the moment.
Well, it's a good point. Obviously, with the 300th anniversary approaching in just a few years, we're very keen for people to let us know of information that they might have, which might have been stored somewhere or in some family memorabilia. So we're all very keen to find out information like that. So if anyone has anything or anything that they think we might be missing, that'd be great.
Yeah, there are a few things that clearly, in terms of documentation, that existed but can no longer be found. So the Cambridge Youths ran a kind of mutual benefit society where they paid in and then paid out money to the widows of members and things like that. And clearly there was a record book kept of that money, but it's disappeared. And they also had slips printed on which people could write the details of the ringing that they wanted to have to pay for. But there are no I can't find any copies of that, either completed or blank. But they printed several hundred of them at various times.
Wow. Okay, well, we're coming to the end, but we have one last question, I think, which is from Mark Norris. It says, bells were put in wooden huts before they went into towers. Were there full peals of bells within those wooden huts? I suppose this is sort of a, like East Bergholt type question.
Yeah, so so the 4 at Great St Mary's, which were, I think, taken out of the tower when the tower was rebuilt, were hung in a wooden shed in the 16th century until they were moved back into the tower. The 5 at St Giles were certainly a ring of 5. And whether it was originally intended to build a tower on that church and they just never got around to it, who knows? But yes, it does seem that they were full rings of bells. Can't quite imagine how they were rung when hanging in a shed, but that's
wow. Yeah, well, we know of one example, right?
We do, yeah, we do. We know of one, yeah.
Right, wonderful. Well, that brings us up to our hour, which I think is a great length of time to be talking about ringing in Cambridge in the 19th century. Absolutely fascinating talk. We've got loads of messages of thanks there for you. It's been absolutely fantastic. So please enjoy the break, and we'd love to see you back sometime in the autumn or winter.
Okay, thanks, Dave. If anybody's got any more questions, you can just email them to me. I'll do my best to answer them, as long as they're not about Christopher Gray.
Brilliant.
So I could find you some information about him with 5 minutes notice.
Brilliant. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much, everybody.
Cheers. Good night.
Bye.